Good evening. So this is the third and the final part on our modeling session on how to tackle a assertion question. I'll be demonstrating using two sources on how you can craft a model answer for this paper. So let's refer to the same document. Let's recap. In the previous video, I talked you through that an assertion question is essential because it comes in every paper and it comprises of up to 10 marks of every paper. When tackling such a question, you need to look at the given statement given to you in question 1E. In this case, GST hike is the best solution to finance Singapore's increasing expenses. You are supposed to use the sources, read the information, and see whether your source agrees with the statement or whether it does not agree with the statement. So in this example, I will demonstrate using sources A and B. So let's look at source A very closely. Source A is a cartoon on the GST hike in Singapore. I always tell my students that when looking at cartoons or pictures, be very careful because there should be minimal words drawn into it, and every detail like emotions and feelings are all drawn with an intended purpose. So look at it very closely, examine all the details and give it a lot of scrutiny. So let's recall. You need to see whether they agree or disagree with the statement that the GST is the best solution. When I look at this, let's describe this. I see three people. They are carrying GST over their shoulders. These three people are looking as though they are suffering. There are some signs drawn there to show that they are trembling or struggling as they carry the GST over their shoulders. These people are carrying the GST sign as they attempt to climb up the slope to catch up with this thing that's drawn called government expenditure. So let's put all this information together. I see three people struggling and suffering as they are burdening themselves with the GST. Then let's look at this source and answer back. Do you think the source agrees with the statement that the GST hike is the best solution? Or is it not the best solution? Let's take 5 seconds to digest this. With the given evidence, it should be clear to you that source A does not agree with the statement that the GST hike is the best way. Is the best way to finance Singapore's increasing expenditure. You have just answered the question over here. Okay, remember, you are supposed to use the sources in the case study. So always start your answer by telling me which is the source that you're using. So in this case, source A. Source A, when you ATQ, it does not agree with the statement. Afterwards, let's describe. This is supported in source A as I can see. I use the word see because this is a cartoon. I see the drawing. I can see three people carrying GST on their shoulders as they attempt to climb up a slope to catch up to government expenditure. I will not stop my evidence over here. It is critical that you describe their negative emotions because isn't that how you determine that this is not a good way? You saw that the people were suffering, right? So you need to include the extra details. I can also see that they are suffering and trembling from the weight that they are carrying. This evidence should be sufficient because the negative emotions is exactly why you determine that this is not a good way to finance Singapore's expenditure. This is your evidence. Lastly, you need to explain. So when explaining, I recommend that you start it with this implies that. This meaning your evidence. Your evidence implies that. Repeat your argument. What is the argument that you're making? This implies that the GST hike, you do not agree with it, right? So this implies that the GST hike is not the best way to finance Singapore's increasing expenditure. Now you need to explain. When explaining, you are trying to use the evidence that you have. You are trying to link it back to support your argument. And the idea of explaining means, in your own words, you should not lift. So please avoid the commonly made mistake of lifting the words that's used in your evidence. Okay, you should not lift anything that you have written previously. So let's try to paraphrase this into a way that answers the question. I can see that this is not the best way because, let's paraphrase, because people are suffering, right? We see, sorry, let's see, okay, because people are suffering, let's see, we used the word suffer earlier, so maybe let's use the word struggling. Sorry, my bad. So we used the word suffering earlier, so maybe let's change it. People are struggling when they have to bear with an increase in their living costs, right? Isn't this what the case study is about? People are suffering when they have to carry this extra burden and weight on them. So I rephrase what I see in the picture. I do not lift. I rephrase it and link it to argue. This is why I can see that it is not a good way. This is not a good way because people are struggling as they bear with this increase in financial costs, in their living costs. This is my explanation. Okay, let me just copy this down so that we can see it very, very clearly. What you have just done is this. You have used source A. Let me blow this up. We have used one of the sources to explain whether it agrees or does not agree with the statement. And I have included the parts of ATQ, right? You've answered the question. You have always, when you make a claim, you back it up with evidence and then you explain why your evidence supports the argument. Your ATQ, evidence and explanation should be repeated for every single source. For express students, this gives you an L2 2 marks. For NA students, this gives you a L2 4 marks. Up to, okay? So in any assertion question, it is 10 marks in total. For express students, when you use many sources, so you use sources A, B, C, sources D, and sources E. When you use up to 5 sources, express students can get up to 8 out of 10 marks of the entire paper, of the entire question. To get your final 2 marks, you will need to conclude your argument. This will be taught to you by your teacher separately. For your NA students, as long as you use up to 5 sources and all of them are done correctly, you can immediately score 10 marks for the paper, for the question again. You do not need to conclude for the NA syllabus. So the more sources I use will warrant me more marks. As such, let me demonstrate another source to you using source B. Source B. Okay. Source B is a little bit complicated, so let's do this together. Source B is from a speech by the Finance Minister Heng. This is in 2018. He says, the decision to increase GST was made to finance things like healthcare, security, and social spending. This one we have talked through earlier and discussed using your background information. The GST gives the government money to spend on society's needs. So these increases will benefit Singaporeans because in the next decade we have an aging population, meaning more old people. And with this extra money collected from GST, we can build new healthcare capacity, such as new hospitals, and we can also invest in new medical technologies to benefit people. So this part next is the crux. The responsible way to pay for all these things like your medical care is through taxation so that every generation pays its share. We should not borrow for spending because this will burden the future generations. This idea is a bit complicated, so let me break it down for you. When the government wants to spend on anything, this spending must come via some form of financing or money. One way of providing this money is via GST. I tax people today, I collect the money immediately, and then I use this money to build facilities for this generation. Another way of spending is the government can use money from its savings, just like we have savings. The government touches the savings and then uses it to build facilities. And then, because I'm using my savings, I do not need to use GST to tax people to finance this spending. This source is arguing that using GST is responsible because you are using today's generation to provide for today's needs. What this means is, okay, if I need to build a hospital in the next year for our generation, I will tax today's people via GST. I will use this money collected from them to build hospitals for them. This is fair. This is better than if, in contrast, I touch the savings. Let's say Singapore's government has 100 billion in savings. Borrowing from savings would mean that I take 50 billion out of this 100 billion. I build the hospital today. However, this is seen to be irresponsible because it will mean that the next generation will have less savings to depend on. It will be unfair to them. So, what this source is trying to argue is this: the only responsible way to pay for spending is by taxation, so that each generation pays for its own needs. This is what this paragraph is saying. So in the last part, this source talks about, okay, the government will continue to absorb GST on education and healthcare. There will also be a GST voucher scheme to provide more help to the lower income. An offset package will also be introduced to help the lower income. So this last part is saying, hey, I know that the increase in GST will burden all of you financially, but don't worry. I, as the government, will give you extra help via GST voucher to help the lower and middle income. So this source has a lot of rich information, but we only need the ones that is relevant to the question. Recall, which of these statements do you think the source is talking about? Do you think the source agrees that the GST is the best way? Or do you think the source is saying that the GST is not the best way? Let's take 5 seconds to digest this. Okay, looking at this highlighted statement, it is very clear that it should come to you naturally that, okay, this way is very good. This way is the best way because it is fair. It is responsible, and it does not burden the future generation, right? The other information that's not highlighted, ignore them because they are not relevant to the question of whether it's the best way to provide for the finances. So again, I will start my answer by saying this is about source B. Source B disagrees with the statement. Source B agrees, Source B agrees with the statement that the GST hike is the best way to finance Singapore's increasing expenses. This is your ATQ, and you have quoted the source. This is then supported in source B as it states, right? It's in text, so it states this part where taxation is responsible and I do not burden the future generation. This is evidence B. Lastly, you explain this. This implies that, okay, your evidence implies your argument. This implies that the GST hike is the best way to finance Singapore's increasing expenses, right? This is repeating the argument, but now you need to explain your evidence. Let's look at this. How can I rephrase this and substitute some keywords so that I can explain my argument? How do you know that through this evidence, the GST is a very good way? It is the best way. Of course, you paid attention to the words responsible and then the words burden, right? So let's try to rephrase that. This implies that the GST hike is the best way to finance the increasing expenses as it is a fair way to raise money and does not, let's rephrase the word burden, it does not impact the future Singaporeans' negatively. I think this is a very short yet clear way to explain. Let me just copy this to the bottom so that we can see them together. Alright, so you have used yet another source. Source B. See, you have stated the source whenever you start your answer. So you started with source B. Source B answers the question. Source B is supported by some relevant evidence. And then lastly, you have explained, and I have to reiterate this again, explaining is the idea of linking your evidence to your argument without lifting. So please, do not make the very fundamental error, like a lot of your classmates will do. Do not lift any single word from the evidence, rephrase them, and then repeat your argument at the start. This implies that the GST is the best way to the GST is the best way to finance expenses because, and then you rephrase your evidence and link it back, because it is a fair way and it does not impact people negatively. Okay, so with these two paragraphs for Express, you would already score L3 5 marks, and for NA, you would already score L3 7 marks. All these are out of 10. Okay, before I end off, I would like to teach you some exam tips. So, like I said earlier, the more sources you use, the higher the marks you get. So in SS, when I mark, I would award people more marks should they display critical thinking, right? Higher ordered thinking. If in the exam you only have time to write 2 paragraphs, you should write paragraphs with alternating arguments. Okay? Instead of writing source A does not agree with the statement, and then you find another source that says does not agree, it is better that you show me that you found a source that does not agree, and then you find another source that says it agrees. By writing the 2 contrasting paragraphs, you would score higher marks than if you wrote 2 paragraphs arguing the same point. Okay, let me demonstrate it to you. If you have time to only write 2 paragraphs, source A agrees, blah blah blah, and source B agrees. Sorry, let me repeat this clearly. Source A agrees plus evidence plus explanation, and then you have a second paragraph. Source B agrees plus evidence plus explanation. This will score you lower marks than if you do source A agrees plus evidence plus explanation, and then you contrast it with source B disagrees plus evidence plus explanation. This highlighted part will score lower marks than the second one because you are able to show contrasting views in the second way. So therefore, we teachers strongly recommend that when you argue sources A to E, try to find sources that alternate in their arguments. Okay? So lastly, to conclude, for your question 1E, start by reading the given statement. Jot down by the side the 2 arguments that comes from this statement. Either you agree with it or you disagree with it. And then look at the sources and its evidences to conclude for yourself whether the source agrees or disagrees. And lastly, whenever you want to craft a paragraph, in each paragraph, it should have the source that you're using, ATQ, evidence, and then explain. ATQ, evidence, and then you explain. And lastly, ATQ, evidence, and you explain. Do this for the 5 sources and you can score almost full marks for the assertion question. Okay, please take note of the explanation portion where I've mentioned do not lift the evidence. You are supposed to rephrase and link it back to your argument. And with that, I will need you to practice sources C, D, and E. Oh, and there's even an F here. Practice the remaining sources, go through them, and craft out your own answers for them. Your teachers will separately show you the model answer so that you can do your own practice. And with that, I'll end this demonstration. Thank you very much.